Picture this. You are standing on the coast of the Black Sea in modern-day Bulgaria. The year is 4500 BC. The pyramids of Giza are not even a dream yet. They are still 2000 years in the future. Stonehenge is a distant fantasy, but here, in this place, a civilization is creating works of art so sophisticated, so breathtaking, that they will not be rivaled for another millennium. They're processing gold with an artistry that seems impossible, building the first fortified city on the entire continent of Europe, and burying their kings with treasures that whisper of a staggering, forgotten power. And then, in a blink of geological time, they vanish. What if I told you the story you think you know about the dawn of civilization is incomplete? What if the very first great civilization of Europe was not the beginning but the end of a story that was washed away by the greatest flood in human history? And if you're using this video to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly what it's for. So maybe hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I genuinely love checking those. It's wild seeing London at sunrise, New York at lunch, Los Angeles at midnight, all watching at the same time. Tonight our journey takes us to the shores of the Black Sea, a place where history and myth collide. We are going to dig deep into the mystery of Bulgaria's Varna culture, a people who challenge everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. We will walk the ramparts of Europe's oldest city, a fortress built not of ambition, but of fear. We will sift through the oldest processed gold ever discovered, a treasure so vast it rewrites the timeline of human society. And then we will look for the ghost in the machine, the cataclysmic event that may have created this civilization and ultimately erased it. We will examine the hard scientific evidence for a biblical scale flood that literally reshaped the world, and we will ask the question that mainstream archaeology is terrified to even whisper. Were these incredible structures, these impossible treasures, the legacy of a world that existed before the Great Flood? The story that archaeology tells us is a neat linear progression. Humans start as hunter-gatherers, they discover agriculture, they form small villages, those villages grow into towns, and eventually great cities and empires emerge. It's a slow, steady march of progress from stone to bronze to iron, but sometimes archaeologists find something that doesn't fit, something that breaks the timeline, something that feels anachronistic, out of place. In 1972, in an industrial zone near the city of Varna, Bulgaria, a tractor operator accidentally uncovered one of these timeline-breaking discoveries. He found a necropolis, a city of the dead. But this was no ordinary graveyard. This was the Varna necropolis, and what lay inside would force us to rethink the very dawn of civilization. Inside more than 300 graves, archaeologists found a treasure that simply should not exist. They found gold, not just a few flakes or simple ornaments, but over 6 kilograms of exquisitely crafted, high-purity gold artifacts. This is, to this day, the oldest worked gold in the world, dating back to between 4600 and 4200 BC. Think about that for a moment. This is 1,000 years before the first dynasties of Egypt. It's 1,500 years before the Minoans on Crete. These were supposedly simple, early farmers, living in the Copper Age, yet they were masters of metallurgy on a scale that is mind-blowing. They weren't just hammering raw nuggets into shape. They were casting, shaping, and polishing gold into intricate bracelets, ceremonial weapons, and hauntingly beautiful anthropomorphic figures. One grave in particular, Grave 43, tells a story that shatters the conventional narrative. Here lay the remains of a man of immense power, a king or a high priest. He was buried with nearly a kilogram of solid gold. A massive golden scepter, a symbol of his temporal power, was clutched in his right hand. His body was adorned with hundreds of gold beads, rings, and appliques. Even his penis was encased in a solid gold sheath. This is not the burial of a simple village chieftain. This is the funeral of a monarch, the head of a complex, stratified society with a ruling class, priests, merchants, and artisans. It displays a level of social hierarchy and wealth concentration that scholars believed was impossible for this period. A discovery like this doesn't just add a new chapter to the history books. It forces you to question the entire table of contents. Where did this knowledge, this power, this staggering wealth come from? It seems to emerge from nowhere, fully formed. And the necropolis was not an isolated miracle. A short distance away lies another site, just as perplexing, just as out of place. This is Provadia Solnitsata. Today it looks like a series of circular earthen rings, but what it represents is unprecedented. It is arguably the first true city, the first fortified urban centre in the history of Europe. Founded around 4700 BC, it was a town built around a single, precious resource: salt. In the ancient world, salt was not a simple condiment. It was a strategic resource, the equivalent of oil today. It was used to preserve food, which allowed for the storage of surpluses, which in turn allowed for the growth of populations and the specialization of labor. Salt was quite literally the engine of civilization. The people of Provadia mastered the production of salt bricks, a technology that made them incomprehensibly wealthy. They traded this white gold across the region, and their prosperity needed to be protected. So they did something that had never been done before on this continent. They built a wall, a massive stone fortification over 10 feet high and 6 feet thick in places. Building such a structure in the 5th millennium BC required a level of social organization, engineering skill, and manpower that is staggering to contemplate. It implies a central authority capable of commanding and organizing a large labor force. It also implies a terrible, ever-present threat. Why would you build such a monumental defense unless you were terrified of what was outside? Who are they so afraid of? So here is the puzzle. We have two sites, Varna and Provadia, that represent a sudden, explosive leap in technological skill, social organization, and wealth. A culture that appears on the world stage with no clear prequel, shining with impossible golden brilliance for a few centuries. And then, around 4200 BC, the light goes out. They vanish. The city of Provadia is abandoned. The Varna culture ceases to exist. There are no signs of conquest, no definitive evidence of a singular plague or famine. They just disappear from the archaeological record, leaving behind their golden ghosts and a profound, unsettling silence. Mainstream archaeology offers tentative explanations. Climate change making the land less arable, or perhaps the migration of new peoples from the Pontic steppe to the east. But these feel like unsatisfying answers to a mystery of this magnitude. It feels like we are missing a key piece of the puzzle, a piece that might not be found in the land, but under the water. To understand what might have happened, we need to zoom out. We need to look at the map not as it is today, but as it was 7,000 years ago. And we need to focus on the heart of this region, the Black Sea. Today, it's a vast saltwater body connected to the Mediterranean. But what if I told you that wasn't always the case? What if I told you that in the memory of humankind, the Black Sea was a completely different world? This is the foundation of a revolutionary and controversial geological theory known as the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis. Put forward by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman of Columbia University, it proposes a cataclysmic event that would have dwarfed any flood in recorded history. Their theory begins with the end of the last ice age. As the great ice sheets that covered much of the globe melted, sea levels worldwide rose dramatically. The Mediterranean Sea swelled, rising hundreds of feet. But the Black Sea was, at that time, cut off. The Bosphorus Strait, the narrow channel that now connects the two seas near modern-day Istanbul, was then a high and dry land bridge, a natural dam holding the Mediterranean back. The Black Sea was a giant freshwater lake, its surface lying more than 300 feet below the level of the rising global ocean. Imagine it, a placid freshwater world, surrounded by vast, fertile plains teeming with life. This was a paradise for Neolithic humans, a perfect cradle for civilization to take root. The shorelines of this lake would have been the most valuable real estate on the planet. But the rising Mediterranean was relentless. It pushed against that earthen dam at the Bosphorus, year after year, century after century, until the pressure became too great. Around 5600 BC, the dam broke. Water began to pour over the threshold. At first it might have been a trickle, but the soft earth and rock would have eroded with terrifying speed. Within a matter of months, the trickle became a torrent, and the torrent became a waterfall of unimaginable proportions. Ryan and Pittman calculate that the flow of water through the Bosphorus would have been 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls. The roar would have been deafening from 100 miles away. Every day, 10 cubic miles of salt water crashed into the freshwater lake, a churning, violent collision of two worlds. For the people living on the shores of that lake, it was the end of the world. The water level rose by 6 inches, sometimes a foot, every single day. The shoreline wasn't just creeping inward, it was sprinting. A village that was a mile from the water one morning could be completely submerged by the next. Ancestral hunting grounds, sacred sites, entire communities, all of it consumed by the inexorable rise of the sea. They were forced to flee with nothing but the stories of their drowned world. Over the course of a year or two, an area of land the size of Ireland was swallowed by the sea. This was not a flood. It was an oceanic invasion. It was a singular event of such terrifying power that it would have been seared into the collective memory of its survivors for generations. Does a story of a world-destroying flood, a chosen few who escape, and the birth of a new world sound familiar? The epic of Gilgamesh, the story of Noah, the flood, myths that are found in cultures all across the globe. Could this be the origin point, the geological memory of a very real apocalypse? The evidence for this staggering event is not just theoretical, it's written in the mud at the bottom of the Black Sea. Ryan and Pittman's research involved drilling core samples from the seafloor. What they found was a clear, unambiguous line in the geological record. Below this line, they found mud layers containing the shells of extinct freshwater mollusks, the fossilized roots of terrestrial plants, and clear evidence of an ancient, dried-out shoreline. And then, directly on top of this layer, they found a thick blanket of marine ooze, or sapropel, filled with the shells of saltwater species native to the Mediterranean. The transition is not gradual, it is sharp, violent, and absolute. It is a geological scar marking the precise moment a freshwater world died and a saltwater sea was born. Expeditions by oceanographers like Robert Ballard, the man who found the Titanic, have even used sonar to identify what appear to be the submerged remnants of ancient structures and shorelines hundreds of feet below the current surface. Now here is where the mystery deepens, where it becomes truly tantalizing. The dates seem to be in conflict. The Black Sea deluge is dated to around 5600 BC. The Varna culture, with its impossible gold and its fortress city, is dated 1,000 years later, from 4600 to 4200 BC. The mainstream interpretation is simple. The flood happened, and then 1,000 years later, 4200 BC, a new culture arose in the same region. But what if that interpretation is too simple? What if it misses the essential human drama of the story? What if the Varna people were not a new culture, but the descendants of the flood survivors? Picture this alternative narrative. A sophisticated, widespread civilization existed on the fertile shores of the great freshwater lake before the deluge. They had advanced knowledge of agriculture, astronomy, and perhaps even metallurgy. They were the ones who lived in the drowned villages that Robert Ballard's sonar may have detected. When the world ended, when the waterfall began to roar, they fled to higher ground, carrying their knowledge and their memories with them. They were a traumatized people, a culture forged in the crucible of cataclysm. For 1,000 years, they lived as refugees in a changed world, passing down the stories of the paradise they had lost and the skills they had retained. And then, around 4600 BC, they re-emerged. They didn't have to reinvent civilization from scratch. They were rebooting it from a saved file. This would explain the Varna culture's sudden sophistication. It wasn't sudden at all, it was inherited. Their mastery of gold wasn't a new invention, it was the salvaged remnant of a pre-flood artistic tradition. The massive walls of Provardia were not just a defence against local tribes, they were the physical manifestation of a deep cultural paranoia. They were built by a people who knew from their own ancestral memory that the world could try to wipe you out in an instant. The sea was not a source of bounty, it was a monster that had devoured their homeland. This new civilization, built on the new coastlines of the Black Sea, was a post-apocalyptic society. Their brilliant, brief flowering was a testament to their resilience, a final defiant golden age before they faded from history. Their disappearance around 4200 BC becomes less mysterious in this light. Perhaps their survivor society was inherently unstable, built on a foundation of trauma that could not last. Or perhaps the climate shifts that archaeologists point to were simply the final straw for a people who had already endured the unthinkable. This idea that the Varna culture was a post-Diluvian civilization, an inheritor of lost knowledge, completely reframes the artifacts they left behind. The golden sceptres are no longer just symbols of a new kingship, but symbols of a renewed kingship, a conscious effort to rebuild a political and religious order that had been shattered. The sheer quantity of gold buried in their graves takes on a new meaning. It is not just conspicuous consumption, it is a desperate offering to the underworld, a plea to the gods who had so thoroughly demonstrated their destructive power. Every golden bead, every polished axe is an echo of a drowned world. This theory transforms the Varna from a prehistoric anomaly into the keepers of a sacred flame, a final link to a chapter of human history that has been almost entirely erased. But there is another possibility, one that is perhaps even more challenging to the conventional timeline. What if the dates are wrong? Radiocarbon dating is a powerful tool, but it is not infallible. It dates organic material, wood, bone, charcoal. It tells you when a tree was cut down to make a post for a house, not when the foundation stone for that house was first laid. It is a well-known phenomenon in archaeology for ancient sacred sites to be used and reused for thousands of years. A Bronze Age tribe might build a temple on top of a Stone Age holy site, which itself was built on a site that was sacred to even earlier peoples. What if sites like the Varna necropolis or the rock sanctuaries found throughout Bulgaria, like Belintash and Perperikon, are far older than we believe? What if the Varna people were simply the last residents of a place that had been continuously occupied since before the Black Sea deluge? This would mean that the deepest layers of these sites are now inaccessible, either buried under tons of earth or completely submerged under the waves of the Black Sea. This idea is fueled by persistent local legends in Bulgaria of a sunken city, a lost civilization lying just off the coast at the mouth of the Ropotamo River. Fishermen for generations have spoken of seeing the remnants of walls and buildings beneath the waves on calm days. While archaeologists have yet to find definitive proof, these stories persist. Are they just folklore, or are they a form of cultural memory, a story passed down through 200 generations about a real place that was lost to the sea? If a pre-flood city did exist, finding it would be the archaeological equivalent of finding a living dinosaur. It would prove that civilization is thousands of years older than we think. The implications are staggering. It suggests that the neat timeline of human progress is a fiction, a comfortable story we tell ourselves. The real story might be far more dramatic and chaotic, a series of advanced cultures that rise, flourish, and are then wiped out by periodic cataclysms, leaving only scattered survivors to pick up the pieces and begin again. We see these reset moments in the geological and archaeological record all over the world. But perhaps the Black Sea deluge, as immense and terrifying as it was itself just a regional aftershock of a far greater, far more ancient global catastrophe. To find the ultimate source of the mystery, we may have to go back further still, to the very end of the last ice age. Let's adjust our focus. The Black Sea deluge of 5600 BC was a world-changing event for the people of that region. But what if it was only the latest chapter in a much longer story of global upheaval? What if the collective trauma that gave birth to the world's flood myths wasn't just about one sea breaking its banks, but about the entire planet's climate being thrown into violent chaos? We have to travel back in time, past the dawn of agriculture, past the founding of the first settlements, to a period known as the Younger Dryas. It is one of the most mysterious and violent periods in the Earth's recent geological history. The Younger Dryas began, with shocking abruptness, around 12,900 years ago. The Earth had been slowly warming, emerging from the deep freeze of the Ice Age. The great glaciers were in retreat, and then something happened. In the space of a decade, perhaps even just a few years, global temperatures plummeted. The warming trend violently reversed and the planet was plunged back into near glacial conditions for more than 1,000 years. It was a climatic catastrophe on a scale that is almost impossible for us to comprehend. For decades, scientists struggled to explain what could have caused such a sudden dramatic shift. The prevailing theories involved complex changes in ocean currents, but a new, more explosive theory has gained significant traction, and it changes everything. This is TCO, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. This hypothesis proposes that around 12,800 years ago, the Earth passed through the debris stream of a disintegrating giant comet. A swarm of fragments, some of them miles wide, slammed into the planet. The primary impact zone, scientists believe, was the vast North American ice sheet that covered most of modern-day Canada and the northern United States. The impacts would have been apocalyptic. The energy released would have dwarfed all the nuclear weapons on Earth combined. It would have instantly vaporized billions of tons of ice, destabilizing the entire ice sheet and unleashing unimaginable floods. But the immediate blasts were only the beginning. The impacts would have thrown a thick veil of dust, ash and water vapor into the atmosphere, blocking out the sun and triggering the sudden, deep freeze of the Younger Dryas. It would have also sparked continent-spanning wildfires, the evidence of which we find today in a thin black layer of soot and charcoal in the soil, a geological scar found on multiple continents. Known as the Younger Dryas boundary layer, the evidence for this cosmic collision is compelling and growing every year. Within this boundary layer, scientists have found materials that can only be formed in conditions of extreme temperature and pressure. They found nanodiamonds, microscopic diamonds forged in the shockwave of an impact. They found melt glass, tiny spherules of rock that were flash heated into liquid and then cooled in mid-air. They found elevated concentrations of platinum, an element that is rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids and comets. This layer of black Earth, filled with the fingerprints of a cosmic impact, has been found at over 50 sites across North and South America, Europe, and Asia. It is a snapshot of the worst day in modern human history. For the people on the ground, the survivors, the world would have been utterly transformed. They would have endured years of darkness and freezing temperatures, a nuclear winter caused by the impact. They would have witnessed the extinction of the great Ice Age beasts. The woolly mammoths, the saber-toothed cats, the giant sloths, they all vanish from the fossil record right at the Younger Dryas boundary. This wasn't a gradual extinction. It was a planetary-scale execution, and for the human populations of the time, the so-called Clovis people of North America, for example, it was a near-total wipeout. And of course, there were the floods. Not the single regional flood of the Black Sea, but global megafloods caused by the catastrophic melting of the ice sheets. The sheer volume of water released would have raised sea levels by hundreds of feet, drowning coastal plains and radically redrawing the maps of every continent on Earth. This was the true Great Flood, a global event caused by fire from the sky. So how does this connect back to the Golden Kings of Bulgaria? It provides a new context, a new origin story. What if the pre-Diluvian civilization that lived on the shores of the Black Sea's freshwater lake wasn't the planet's first great civilization, but merely a remnant, a colony of an even older and more widespread Ice Age civilization that was all but destroyed during the Younger Dryas cataclysm? What if sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which dates back to 9600 BC, right as the Earth finally began to re-warm after the Younger Dryas cold snap, were built by the immediate survivors of this global apocalypse? Göbekli Tepe, with its massive, intricately carved T-shaped pillars, appears fully formed, just like Varna, with no clear technological precursor. Its builders were supposedly simple hunter-gatherers, yet they accomplished an engineering and artistic feat that defies explanation. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe was not a temple to invent a new world, but a library of stone, a message in a bottle from a lost one, a place to preserve the sacred knowledge of a civilization that had been brought to its knees. Now, let's follow that thread forward through time. For the next 6,000 years, from the end of the Younger Dryas, around 9600 BC, to the rise of the Varna culture, around 4600 BC, the survivors and their descendants would have been in a state of recovery. They would have been scattered, their numbers reduced, their high knowledge fragmented. They would have passed down the stories of the catastrophe, the sky falling, the world drowning, stories that would eventually become our myths. They would have preserved what they could of their ancient science, their astronomy, their engineering, their art. This was a long, dark age of rebuilding, and one of the places they may have eventually settled and consolidated their power was the uniquely sheltered and fertile basin of the pre-flood Black Sea. In this new light, the Varna culture is no longer just a post-Black Sea deluger society. They are a distant echo of a much older, much grander Ice Age civilization. They are a link in a chain of transmission that stretches all the way back to a world before the Younger Dryas impact. This would explain their anomalous sophistication, their metallurgy, their social structure, their astronomical knowledge. It was the product of thousands of years of preserved, rediscovered, and re-implemented knowledge. They were the heirs to a forgotten science. The enigmatic rock-cut sanctuaries that dot the Bulgarian landscape, like Belintash, often interpreted as later Thracian creations, could be far, far older. They could be the astronomical observatories of this survivor culture, calendars used to track the heavens with a desperate intensity, a way of watching the skies to make sure the catastrophe never happened again. This narrative connects all the dots. It explains the sudden appearance of high culture at Varna. It provides a deeper, more powerful origin for the Black Sea deluge itself, reframing it as a later consequence of the initial Ice Age meltdown. It explains the psychological need for the massive walls at Provadia as the legacy of a people who had seen the world literally torn apart, and it gives a reason for their ultimate disappearance. Perhaps they were a fragile echo, a culture whose brilliance was based on looking backward, a society that could not ultimately escape the shadow of the cataclysm that had created them. Their story is a warning, written in gold and stone. It tells us that civilization is not a straight line upwards, but a fragile cycle. It rises, it falls, and sometimes it is wiped clean. So we began our journey sifting through the impossible gold of a mysterious culture on the Black Sea. We found ourselves in the path of a biblical flood that drowned a continent's worth of land, providing a terrifyingly real origin for some of our most ancient myths. And that path led us further back to a global catastrophe of fire and ice, a cosmic impact that may have reset the course of human history entirely. The megastructures and treasures of ancient Bulgaria, therefore, may not be evidence of the dawn of civilization, but rather evidence of a great forgetting. They are the monuments of the children of a lost world, the inheritors of a broken legacy. The story you think you know is not just incomplete, it may be written in reverse. We are taught to see these ancient peoples as primitive, as the humble beginnings of our own glorious ascent. But what if they saw themselves very differently? What if they saw themselves as the diminished descendants of a golden age, struggling to rebuild a world that had been shattered beyond recognition? What if we are the ones with amnesia, and they were the ones who remembered? This changes our entire relationship with the past. These ruins are not just curiosities. They are echoes of our own fragility, a testament to the fact that everything we have built, our cities, our technology, our knowledge, could be wiped away in a geological instant. Their story is a profound reminder that we are a species with a hidden history, a backstory that is far more dramatic and perhaps far more advanced than we have ever been led to believe. The earth holds its secrets close, but the clues are there, buried in the mud beneath the sea, locked in the platinum signature of a cosmic collision, and gleaming in the enigmatic gold of a long-vanished king. We are left to wonder, what other forgotten truths, what other lost chapters of the human story are still out there, waiting for us to dig deep enough to find them? Let's look closer at the ghosts in that necropolis, because the story they tell is not just one of power and wealth. It is a story of profound loss. Among the 300 graves uncovered at Varna, dozens were not graves at all. They were cenotaphs, symbolic graves. They held no human bones, no physical remains of a person. Instead, where the head should have been, archaeologists found exquisitely crafted, life-sized masks of unbaked clay, adorned with the same stunning gold jewellery as the real burials. Golden diadems on their foreheads, golden earrings, and golden necklaces. Think about what that means. These were not just memorials. They were elaborate, ritually significant burials for people whose bodies could not be found. People who were, for all intents and purposes, lost. Why would a culture invest so much of its almost sacred wealth, the oldest worked gold on earth, to bury an empty space? Unless, of course, they had a deep cultural familiarity with losing people in a way that left no body to recover. A people whose recent history was defined by their loved ones being swallowed by the sea would understand this perfectly. These empty graves are perhaps the most haunting evidence of all. They are a silent testament to a people trying to reclaim their dead from the water, to give a soul a final resting place when the body has been taken by the abyss. The craftsmanship of the gold itself begs an even deeper question. To achieve the purity and complexity seen in the Varna artifacts requires more than just a lucky discovery of raw nuggets. It requires a sophisticated understanding of metallurgy. It requires prospecting, mining, refining the ore, and then working it. These are not separate skills. They are a chain of technologies, a complete industrial process that does not simply spring into being. Where are the thousands of years of trial and error that should precede this level of mastery? We don't find them. It's as if this culture was handed a completed textbook on metallurgy and told to get to work. Consider the techniques involved. They were casting gold, a process which requires controlled high-temperature furnaces. They were creating delicate gold beads using granulation, a technique where tiny spheres of gold are fused to a surface without melting the entire piece, something that would baffle even Roman goldsmiths thousands of years later. This is not the work of Copper Age farmers who just happened upon a shiny rock. This is the signature of a long and deep tradition of scientific and artistic knowledge. A tradition whose earlier chapters seem to have been torn out of the book. The saved file theory becomes more than just a metaphor. It becomes the most logical explanation. They were working from a blueprint that their ancestors had already perfected, and what of the symbols this gold was shaped into? The most prominent and powerful image from the Varna and surrounding cultures is the bull. Golden bull figurines were buried with the dead. The horns of the great aurochs, the wild cattle of ancient Europe, were seen as symbols of immense power, vitality, and perhaps divinity. In the context of a survivor culture, this symbolism takes on a new layer of meaning. A bull is a creature of the earth. It is powerful, grounded, and fertile. It is the absolute opposite of a chaotic, formless, destructive ocean. The veneration of the bull could be a psychological anchor for a people adrift in a new world, a way of reaffirming their connection to the solid ground beneath their feet, a defiant celebration of life in the face of the memory of total destruction. This symbolic language was not limited to gold. The pottery of the Varna and the wider culture of Old Europe, as archaeologist Maria Gimbutas called it, is covered in a complex system of geometric patterns, spirals, meanders, chevrons. Mainstream archaeology often dismisses these as simple decorations. But what if they are more? What if they are a form of sacred geometry, a remnant of a lost science or cosmology? Spirals represent cycles of time, cosmic motion, the flow of energy. Meanders can represent water, or the path of life, or even a labyrinth. These are not random doodles. They are abstract concepts given form. They are the software of a culture, a way of encoding their understanding of the universe. A universe that, for them, was both creative and terrifyingly destructive. Their art was not merely decorative, it was a way of imposing order on chaos. And this quest for order seems to have been a regional phenomenon. The Varna culture was not an island of sophistication in a sea of primitive tribes. It was the apex of a vast and interconnected network of cultures that flourished in the Balkans for millennia, a civilization now referred to as Old Europe. Stretching from the Danube River Valley to the shores of the Aegean, these societies were remarkably advanced. Before Varna's gold, the Vinca culture, in what is now Serbia, was creating stunning anthropomorphic figurines, and most astonishingly of all, a system of symbolic writing. The Vinca symbols, found inscribed on pottery and clay tablets, date as far back as 5300 BC. That is nearly 2,000 years before Sumerian cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphs. This was proto-writing, a system of communication that completely shatters the myth that writing began in Mesopotamia. So we have a civilization in Old Europe that develops writing, masters complex pottery, builds large settlements, and then culminates in the Varna culture, which perfects metallurgy on an industrial scale. This is not a slow, steady march of progress. It is an explosion. It suggests that this entire region was the crucible for a different model of civilization, one that predated the familiar empires of the Near East. A civilization that seems to have been more peaceful, more artistic, and perhaps organized around the worship of a great goddess whose image is found everywhere in their art. But their story is not the one we are told. Why? Because their world came to an end. The Black Sea deluge would have struck directly at the heart of this civilization, drowning its most fertile lands and scattering its people. It wasn't the beginning of civilization that happened in Sumeria. It was a reboot, started by a different group of people in a different part of the world. While the original cradle of European civilization lay drowned and forgotten, this inherited knowledge wasn't just practical, like metallurgy, or philosophical, like their sacred symbols. It may have been deeply rooted in a science that was absolutely essential for survival: astronomy. Throughout Bulgaria, perched on remote mountaintops, are enormous rock sanctuaries. Sites like Belintash and Paperikon are vast complexes of thrones, altars, basins, and steps carved directly out of the living rock. Conventionally, they are attributed to the much later Thracian tribes of the Iron Age. But many of the carvings show weathering patterns that suggest a far greater antiquity, and their true purpose remains a profound mystery. But when you analyse their layouts, a pattern emerges. These are not random carvings. They are precisely aligned to celestial events. They are giant stone calendars. They mark the positions of the sun during the solstices and equinoxes. They align with the rising and setting of specific bright stars and constellations, like Sirius and the Pleiades. These were not just places of worship. They were observatories, sophisticated instruments for tracking the passage of time and the movement of the heavens. Why would a supposedly simple farming culture go to such monumental effort to build these complex astronomical devices? Perhaps for agriculture, to know when to plant and when to harvest. That is the simple answer. But for a survivor culture, the answer is much deeper. If your ancestors' world was destroyed, if you passed down stories of a time when the sky itself fell, or the world was drowned, you would not look at the heavens with simple wonder. You would look at them with fear and intense focus. You would track the movements of the stars and planets with a desperate precision, searching for anomalies, for omens, for any sign that the great cataclysm could happen again. These observatories were not just for farming. They were an early warning system. They were the product of a deep-set cultural trauma, a society collectively holding its breath and watching the sky forever. Their science was born from the memory of a planetary catastrophe. This psychological lens changes how we see every artifact they left behind. It forces us to see their culture not as a beginning, but as an elaborate and beautiful response to an ending. The massive walls of Provadia are no longer just a defense against local marauders. They are a psychological barrier against a universe that has proven itself to be hostile. A defiant statement carved in stone that says, "We will not be washed away again." The sheer, almost obsessive quantity of gold buried at Varna is no longer just a display of wealth. It's a form of magic, an offering. Gold is the colour of the sun. It is immortal. It does not tarnish or decay. By surrounding their dead with the incorruptible, sun-like brilliance of gold, they were making a plea to the cosmos. They were trying to buy their ancestors a permanent safe passage to a world of light, away from the cold, dark, watery chaos that had claimed their past. Their entire society can be read as a grand ritual designed to heal a deep wound. Their social hierarchy, with a powerful priest-king at its head, was not just about controlling resources. It was about re-establishing a divine order, creating a figure who could mediate between the fragile world of humans and the terrifying power of the gods. The king with his golden scepter was not just a ruler, he was a shaman, a cosmic guardian whose job was to hold the forces of chaos at bay. The brief, brilliant flowering of the Varna culture, lasting only a few centuries, now makes a tragic kind of sense. It was a fever dream of recovery, a culture burning with an intense, backward-looking light. They poured all of their ancestral energy, all of their salvaged knowledge, into one spectacular blaze of golden glory. But a society built on memory and fear is inherently brittle. When new pressures arrived, climate shifts, resource depletion, migrating peoples from the steppes, their carefully reconstructed world may have simply been too fragile to endure. They did not just vanish, they finally succumbed to the echoes of a catastrophe that had happened 1,000 years before. This reframing forces us to confront a deeply unsettling possibility. We view history as a ladder, with our modern civilization perched securely at the top. But the story of Varna suggests history is a wave. It rises in brilliance, crests, and then crashes back into the sea, leaving only scattered debris on the shore for the next wave to find. We are not the first. We may not even be the most advanced in every respect. We have simply been lucky enough to ride a wave during a period of relative geological calm. The people of Varna were the unlucky ones who came just after a crash, and they spent their entire existence trying to piece together a story whose beginning they could only remember through myth and fragmented knowledge. What then of their ultimate fate? The classic explanation points to the arrival of the Kurgan people, horse-riding warriors from the Pontic Caspian steppe, as the force that displaced or destroyed the peaceful, matrifocal civilization of old Europe. This narrative is tidy. It pits a warlike patriarchy against a peaceful matriarchy. But the evidence for a violent conquest at Varna or Provadia is thin. There are no widespread layers of ash and destruction, no mass graves filled with the casualties of war. The end was quieter, more insidious. It feels more like a slow fade than a sudden death. Perhaps the answer lies not in a single cause, but in a perfect storm of pressures, acting on a society already stretched to its psychological breaking point. Imagine the climate shifts that archaeologists propose. A period of cooling and aridification begins around 4200 BC. For a normal culture, this would mean hardship, famine, and migration. For a culture whose foundational myth is a world-destroying environmental catastrophe, it would feel like the beginning of the end, all over again. The delicate social contracts that held their complex society together could have frayed and then snapped. The people would have lost faith in their golden kings and their sky-watching priests. Their elaborate system, designed to prevent another apocalypse, would have been seen as a failure. The abandonment of their cities would not have been a retreat, but a crisis of faith, a spiritual collapse. They scattered, not because they were conquered, but because their world-view had been broken. Their great experiment in post-apocalyptic civilization had finally run out of time. This interpretation places the human element back at the centre of the story. It is a tale of memory, trauma, and resilience. It is the story of a people who inherited a nightmare and tried to build a dream on top of it. They looked back at a lost golden age and tried to recreate it, smelting the real metal to try and recapture the metaphorical one. For a few shining centuries, they succeeded, creating a society of baffling sophistication and haunting beauty. Their legacy is a profound warning that a civilization is more than just its technology and its cities. It is a shared belief, a story people tell themselves to make sense of the universe. And when that story breaks, the civilization breaks with it. The golden ghosts of Varna are not just a historical curiosity, they are a mirror. They show us a version of humanity that was forged in a crucible we can barely imagine, and they ask us a silent, deeply unsettling question. How strong is the story we tell ourselves today? What would be left of our world if it were broken? This question leads us to the most tangible and frustrating part of this entire mystery. The evidence we need most, the proof of that pre-flood world, is in the one place we can barely look. It is hundreds of feet beneath the surface of the Black Sea. This is not like searching for ruins in a desert or a jungle. This is searching for a lost continent in a cold, dark and alien world. The challenges are immense, but the potential reward is the single greatest archaeological discovery in human history. Oceanographers have dragged sonar sleds across the abyssal plains of the Black Sea floor, painting a picture of what lies beneath with sound. They have mapped ancient riverbeds, deltas and coastlines, the ghost of a landscape that has not seen the sun in over 7,000 years. And on those drowned shores they have found anomalies, rectangular shapes that look eerily like the foundations of buildings, mounds that appear too symmetrical to be natural formations. Dr. Robert Ballard describes seeing, on his remote camera feeds, what looked for all the world like worked stone tools and ceramic fragments lying on a surface that was once dry land. But here is where the sea both hides and preserves. The Black Sea is a unique body of water. Below a depth of about 500 feet, it is anoxic. There is no oxygen. This means the microscopic organisms that cause decay on a normal sea floor cannot survive here. Wood does not rot. Leather does not disintegrate. Even the delicate rigging of a sunken ship can remain intact for thousands of years. It is the world's largest natural preservation chamber. Lying in that cold, oxygen-free darkness could be the prehistoric equivalent of Pompeii. Not a city buried in ash, but an entire civilization pickled in time. We could find the wooden posts of their houses, the handles of their tools, the boats they used to fish the freshwater lake, perhaps even the perfectly preserved bodies of the flood's first victims. The potential is mind-blowing. Finding an intact Neolithic settlement from before 5600 BC would be like finding the blueprints for civilization itself. It would prove, once and for all, that the story of Varna does not begin at Varna. It begins with their drowned ancestors. It would give us the prequel that is missing from all of our history books. But until we commit the immense resources needed for a full-scale, deep-sea archaeological excavation, this lost world remains a tantalizing ghost, a theory whispered from the grainy images of a sonar screen. And this drowned world was not some isolated outpost. It was, in all likelihood, the very heartland of the civilization we now call Old Europe. This was a culture that dominated the Balkans for 3,000 years, from roughly 7,000 to 4,000 BC. The Varna culture was not its beginning. It was its magnificent and tragic end. The archaeologist Maria Gimbutas dedicated her life to uncovering this lost civilization, and what she described was a world profoundly different from our own. She painted a picture of societies that were largely peaceful and matrifocal, meaning they were centered around women, though not necessarily ruled by them. They were deeply artistic and lived in large, well-organized towns with populations in the thousands, long before the first cities rose in Mesopotamia. They built two-story houses, performed complex rituals, and developed an incredibly sophisticated pottery tradition. And everywhere, in every settlement, you find the same icons, the ubiquitous female figurines, the bird goddess, the snake goddess, the great goddess of birth, death, and regeneration. This was a culture that worshipped the creative and cyclical powers of nature, embodied in the female form. Imagine a civilization whose primary values were not conquest, power, and hierarchy, but stability, artistry, and a deep reverence for the natural world. Their wealth was not measured in hoards of gold until the very end, but in beautifully crafted objects for daily and ritual use. This was the world that existed on the shores of that freshwater lake, a world of artists and farmers, builders and priests, living in a long-established harmony with their environment. Now imagine a waterfall 200 times the size of Niagara ripping that world apart. The psychological scar left on the survivors would have been unimaginable. Their entire cosmological worldview would have been shattered. The great goddess, the embodiment of nature, had seemingly turned on her children with a terrifying, inexplicable violence. Perhaps this explains the sudden, almost desperate appearance of so much gold at Varna. It was a new kind of offering, a new kind of magic. Gold, the metal of the sun, a male symbol of eternal, unchanging power, was perhaps being used to appease or even defend against the chaotic, watery power of the wounded goddess. The society may have shifted, out of sheer terror, from a matrifocal worldview to a more patriarchal one, seeking a new kind of strength in a new kind of god, embodied by the Golden King in Grave 43. Into this deeply traumatized, post-apocalyptic world of the Varna people and their neighbours, a new force appeared from the east. From the vast grassy steppes north of the Black and Caspian Seas came a people known to archaeologists as the Yamnaya, the likely progenitors of the Indo-Europeans. These were not settled farmers and artists, they were nomadic pastoralists, warriors on horseback who had mastered the wheel and the chariot. They worshipped a pantheon of male gods of the sky, of thunder and war. Their culture was built around mobility, conquest, and a rigid patriarchal hierarchy. Their arrival in old Europe was not just a migration, it was a collision of two fundamentally different realities, two opposing ways of being human. The old theory was one of violent conquest, of Yamnaya warriors sweeping across Europe, destroying the peaceful goddess cultures and imposing their own language and religion by the sword. But recent evidence suggests a more complex and perhaps more drawn-out process. And the most powerful evidence we have is written not in stone or clay, but in our very own DNA. The field of archaeogenetics has allowed us to extract and analyse ancient DNA from human remains that are thousands of years old. And when scientists analyse the DNA of the people of old Europe, including skeletons from the Varna necropolis, they found they were descended almost exclusively from the first Neolithic farmers who had migrated from Anatolia thousands of years earlier. But when they analysed skeletons from the same region just a few centuries later, after 4000 BC, the genetic picture is completely different. The old farmer DNA is almost entirely gone, replaced by a new genetic signature, that of the Yamnaya from the eastern steppe. Let that sink in. This was not a case of two cultures meeting and mixing. This was a near total population replacement. Within the space of a dozen generations, the genetic lineage of old Europe was virtually wiped out. Whether this happened through violent conquest, the introduction of new diseases like the plague, to which the farmers had no immunity, or through a process of cultural and economic dominance, where the farmers were simply outcompeted, the end result was the same. The people who had survived the Great Flood, the people who built Provadia and buried their kings in gold, vanished not just from the archaeological record, but from the human gene pool of the region. This is the final brutal chapter in the tragedy of Varna. Their world was destroyed by water, and then their descendants were erased by men. It is a story of a double extinction. It explains why their memory was so thoroughly buried. The new peoples who came to dominate Europe had no connection to the drowned world. What does this forgotten narrative, this double extinction, truly tell us about the terrifying fragility of civilization? The legacy of Varna is not merely a tale of a lost city or a vanished people. It's a stark, chilling echo reverberating through the vast corridors of human history. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that even the most advanced, most glittering societies can be utterly erased, not just from memory, but from the very genetic fabric of a continent. Their sophisticated world, swallowed first by the rising waters, then by the inexorable tide of new populations, leaves us with a profound question. How many other golden ages, how many other incredible human achievements lie buried beneath the sands of time, utterly forgotten, waiting for the patient spade of an archaeologist or the piercing gaze of a geneticist to reveal their silent, staggering truth? Their story, once lost, now serves as a haunting testament to the impermanence of all things, reminding us to question the history we think we know. And what other mysteries, what other erased worlds do you believe still whisper from the deep past?